That's right. Survivor Worldwide is back with another recap episode on Australian Survivor, episodes 19, 20, and 21 this week. Now, if you're getting into it today and you're thinking, what happened? You guys are a day late. I put my hand up and apologize. I asked Riley to postpone this recap with at least 24 hours because I've had the most crazy week at work. I've been swamped at work, so I just couldn't get through the episodes and watch it. And it's been one of the toughest weeks for me, Riley, to not get spoiled because I'm so used to jumping on social media at different times. And obviously, I've had to stay off social media. I've had people message me. I can't open my Facebook Messenger because they know I watch the show as well. But I made it to today, spoiler 3, and I've watched all of the episodes back to back to back. So I'm ready to talk about it. Riley, how are you doing and how do you feel about this week's episodes?
Yeah, I actually love this week's episodes. I think the week before I was a little bit skeptical about all the twists being thrown at the wall, and certainly while there was a huge game-changing twist this week, I actually didn't mind it. I did like the Earn twist, and we'll obviously discuss that later and why I liked it. But certainly, I think we're getting towards the pointy end of the game now. All females left except for George, which is just crazy to think about. And if you told me that last week, I wouldn't have been expecting it at all, even though it was pretty clear cut that would be happening. But we've got so many strong characters going into this final week of Survivor that I'm really excited to see how it turns out.
100%. And Jenny here with the first comment. As always, Jenny, welcome to the live stream, saying that she really loved Way's winning immunity, brought her to tears, and the most exciting immunity win on Survivor Australia ever. And I know that we like to run this ship quite loose when it comes to Australian Survivor. We go all over the place and we talk about different talking points at different places. So I guess why not start with the Way winning of immunity? For me, that was probably the most exciting part of the whole week. I enjoyed that more than anything else. And surprise, surprise, it wasn't a twist like the Earns and somebody being saved or some wacky thing that was happening. It was just good old classic Survivor with someone, an underdog, going out there playing in an immunity challenge who had to come from behind. She was so far behind on that obstacle course, struggled to pick up the hammer, could barely pick up the hammer to hit those wooden things, but she ended up coming from behind. And what a performance for her to pull out the win here. And how refreshing was it to finally see a brain-themed challenge, because we've had almost none of it since the merge.
Yeah, great to see Wei pull out the win. And, she did a great job at the word puzzle. Basically, she looked at it and straight away got it, which was amazing to see just how much of a comeback she made in that challenge. Really great to see. And we did see a lot of content from Wei this week. She's really starting to take shape, I think, as one of the key players towards this end game. And, the week before we were discussing how we didn't get too much Wei content. And this week I was very happy with what we got from basically all the characters in the game. I think definitely an improvement on last week in terms of the edit and the twist as well. Very evenly balanced, and things are really heating up here. And things are going to be crazy next week, I think, as we head into the last 3 episodes of Australian Survivor.
No, 100%. And I think that, looking at this, towards the end game here, you've got to wonder, are there going to be a little bit of a change to some of the immunities that we're going to see? Are we going to see a few more now with some brain components to it? And can Wei potentially be that underdog that will actually win a couple of immunities here towards the end? I think that Hayley has been looking at Wei as that person that she can drag to the end that hasn't really done much in the game. But if Wei does end up winning a couple of immunity challenge here towards the pointy end of the game, she may become a little bit of a threat here for Hayley, someone that has been voted out of the game. I know we spoke about this coming live here tonight, and you said that it doesn't really matter to you too much that Hayley's been voted out of the game. And I think that with Australian Survivor, it definitely is its own beast, right? If I look at all the different survivors around the world, Australian Survivor will always have non-eliminations. And again, we had non-eliminations this week as well. And it doesn't look like the people who are playing this game, they're not the super fans that are very traditionalist in regards to what they value in the game. So I do wonder how much of anything it really will be against Hayley. I think they will give her more props and more kudos for the fact that she won her way back. And I feel like this specific tribe, every season they've got different people out there that value different things in the game. But it's been one of those seasons where there's been a lot of brawn heavy, challenge beast threat type of players out there where I feel like a lot of them will actually give her more credit for the fact that she had to battle her way in and beat Baden to come back into the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it will be interesting to see, what happens. Really, I give basically all of the final 5 a chance to win at this point, other than maybe Kara. I think Kara is probably the one that doesn't really have the case to make at Final Tribal Council. Although, if she's able to cut George, then that's going to be something that might work out in her favor. But certainly, when you look at the final five, I think anyone really has the chance to win. And even if they were in a scenario against each other, George or Haley, I could see either of them winning against each other. So too, Wei, I think it depends on what the jury values, and that's going to be something really interesting to see what happens. As we see whether Haley decides to turn her back on George and Kara at this stage, viewing them as too big of a threat, or if they continue along the same brains strong line at this point and just go and get Flick out of the game. So it is going to be interesting to see, loyalties be tested at this point. Who wins immunity? Because the idols are basically out of the game at this point. The next tribal council will probably assure Flick of safety, but certainly beyond that, it will just be every man or woman at this point in the game for themselves. So really exciting and juicy to see who really goes up against each other, because I think everyone has an equal chance at this point.
100%. And also with 3 out of 5 people already having been eliminated traditionally from the game and either being saved by a twist or came back into the game, Haley's really got, and all of them have really got a little bit of an option here. And I do say Haley because to me, it very much still feels like Haley is in the driver's seat. She, throughout these 3 episodes, were the ones with her and Wei being in the middle. She could flip any way she wanted to basically choose who she would want to proceed the game with. I feel like a lot of things that she did this week and not taking that shot on George and Kara prior to going to the final 5, in my opinion, was the correct moves. I know you said you had some thoughts about taking Danny out in the spot, and we'll definitely get into that. But I feel like she kind of set herself up perfectly here, where we know Flick is someone who potentially will work with her, potentially will come over to work with her in Wei, where I really think that George and Kara potentially could be the next 2 that are really in danger here. And George has played the most impressive game up until this point. I don't think in Haley's mind she envisions any way forward with George specifically, and I don't think that we'll see that dream finale that a lot of people would love to see between Haley and George here at the end game.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly going to come to a head. And we've seen George and Haley clash before Haley was voted out for the first time. So certainly to see that rivalry potentially reignited will be really interesting, because, I don't think Haley views George as being someone she can bring to Final Tribal Council, which is why I was shocked that Danny was eliminated in this instance. But we'll discuss that later. But a great week and lots to unpack.
100%. So just looking here at the live chats here, Marcus Evans saying, hello, evening, guys, and letting us know that the finale will be on Sunday, September 12th, not next Tuesday, which we're aware of. So we probably will look at doing the finale podcast either on that Monday or Wednesday following. We'll lock in a time. Keep an eye on my social Twitter handle. If you don't know what that is, have a look at the description. I should have my Twitter in there to say whenever we go live. Also, Loyal is saying here that he didn't expect this season would be so interesting after a big last season with greats. And also from Loyal, he's saying that George or Haley are sure to go out next episode with the compulsory play of the idol, except any twists like going to Exile Island, which I don't think we'll see another twist at this stage. I think we're out of twists now, probably going to the end game, right, Riley?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, as I said before, every man and woman for themselves at this point. And the only real hurdle to overcome now is Flick's idol, which I think is basically going to be played at next Tribal Council. There's no other option for it to be played. So I believe idols expire at Final 5 in Australian Survivor. So it seems Flick will basically be safe. Unless she wins individual immunity and plays it for someone else, it'll certainly be something to keep an eye out for. But it's all coming to a head.
Also, Dale, welcome back in the live stream as well. Dale says, I think it's more of a surprise that we haven't had a winner yet who has been eliminated and has come back, given the amount of challenges, non-elimination episodes, and castaways. And I do agree. And I think that as we continue Australian Survivor, if you don't like it, I've got some bad news. I think it's here to stay, Riley, and that, we will see more non-elimination castaways come back in the future. And, if one of these non-eliminated castaways do win this season, surely they won't be the last to do it in such a fashion.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely no question. It's never been, there's never been a doubt about the fact that Australian Survivor love to put in these non-elimination twists. And we've discussed this many times on the show about the necessity with the 24 episode schedule and only having 24 castaways. It is an evil, but it's a necessary evil nonetheless, and certainly something that we will see in the future. But I'm really glad this season, I think especially in this last week, I did like the Earns twist that they implemented. And while it's annoying having these non-elimination twists, I feel as though it takes more luck into the hands of the survivors. And by having those 4 Earns there at Tribal Council and saying one of them has a scroll in there that will save you from the vote, It really adds a different layer of variance to the game that I think it adds more luck and more predictability as to who might stay safe, as opposed to just having a random twist at the final six to say, someone loses their vote at this tribal council or something like that. You always have the possibility of being voted out, but there's a chance for everyone. Everyone has an equal chance to be saved.
Yeah, so as soon as they brought the urns out here in the first episode, the whole theme throughout the episode was Andrew versus George, and every single episode it was the Minority Alliance versus George. They've been trying to take George out now for 3 episodes in a row, basically. Andrew going up there and going for the urn. I actually, for some other reason, I had my tinfoil hat on thinking, they can easily choose whenever they have a safety voucher or a scroll in there, and when they don't have it, and swap it in and out depending on who's potentially going to be voted out. They could make it so that each one of them has safety in it. We just don't know. As viewers, we have to trust that they're going to be doing the right thing, but we also know that the producers love to make a very big spectacle out of Survivor, especially in the Australian version. They try to hype up the drama. So for me, for a second, when Andrew went up there, I thought maybe all of them will have safety, and obviously he doesn't get safety here in the first opportunity, which now makes the rest of the players, like you say, it made them aware of potentially what could happen in the next couple of votes. And I think that in some degree, it probably saved George to a certain degree, because, Haley thought about turning on George a couple of times here earlier in the week, but prior to the urn being out of play, she also mentioned that if you take a shot at a player such as George and he comes back in the game, he's most likely to come for you, and he's an extremely capable player. So, when it comes to the strategy of who you're voting out, you need to think about that. Do you vote someone out that is in your alliance that can come back bitter and that can swing over to the minority alliance and gives them power? Or do you stick strong with your alliance members and rather vote against someone that is already in the minority? So if they do come back, they don't really have the power to come back after you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's certainly something we'll discuss later when we take a look at that vote between Flick and George. But Andrew has really surprised me this season. We didn't see too much of him prior to the merge, but especially over the last couple of weeks, has really emerged as a big character, more so in terms of being a threat, obviously winning a couple of challenges there, and really pitting himself against George and being determined to get him out of the game, especially after Laura was voted out a couple of episodes ago as well. So really seeing him take on a life of his own in the game and aligning himself with the Brawn tribe, it's, Flick and, Haley and Wei have become so ingrained with Kara and George at this point, which I was almost shocked that they haven't been as flexible and they have been voting along those same lines all week. It really did surprise me that neither of them flipped on George, especially given how big of a threat George is. But, Andrew really playing a big game and putting himself out there as a major threat in the game.
Yeah, it is quite interesting. And I thought about that. You had Haley, Wei, and George, who all 3 of them were a part of the Joey blind side as well. So they have worked together early in the season. There were some sort of trust. But I think, when you look at that group, Wei was the one that was the most complex to me. I didn't understand where her sort of her thoughts were coming into this week, because I think we even spoke about that last week where we said, what's happened to Wei? She hasn't gotten an edit, but we now sort of find out that she very much works with her gut. And in this episode, she wants to save Andrew because Andrew and her have been playing the game together since they dot from the beginning, and they were never against each other here. But, George very, very smartly here finds a way. I think this is what, for me personally, makes George one of the all-time great players of Australian Survivor, is the fact that he's able to find these cracks and make people paranoid. And I think because he's such a, unpredictable player in the game, it's something where people never know what he's going to come up with next. But he goes to Wei and he tells Wei that Andrew pitched to vote against Wei, and he actually gets Wei to believe him, and Wei here, against her best interest, goes and votes out someone that potentially was never going to come for her.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Wei certainly emerging as a big character this week, really considering where her perception in the game stands and, working really tightly with Haley, which was really nice to see those two coming together and sort of working their way through the game, determining which was the best path to go towards. And certainly working with George, I think, he does eliminate a big threat in Andrew, because certainly if Andrew wins a couple of immunity challenges, he could very well work his way to the end. Whereas, with the girls and getting Andrew out of the game, it's much more of a level playing field, I think, and it gives them more options going ahead in the game. So it's certainly a smart move, I think, for Haley and Wei to work with George and, try and get rid of the big threat in in Andrew as well. And added to that, it also gives them the opportunity to look at a potential all women's alliance, which we've seen come up a couple of times this week. The women wanting to come together against George and Cara. And take out the only remaining man in the game. But the women really have been running this season. It's been amazing to see. And I didn't really even consider it or think about it until this week when Andrew went home. But, the only woman on the jury at this point, I believe, is Laura.
Yeah, 100%. And I wanted to also add here to this, it's quite interesting because, Andrew, he was an interesting player throughout the game. We didn't see much of his game. We didn't really see much of his strategizing. But like you said, he became a bigger character just prior to his boot, probably about 2 eps going into his boot. We started seeing a little bit more of Andrew, but I find it really hard to sort of pick where he went wrong. What was the thing that Andrew didn't do right? To me personally, I think the only thing I could point to was that after the vote where Emmett gets voted out, he goes to Haley and he talks to her, and Haley picks up that, he's never going to work with her again. So he came across as somebody after those 2 times that she's betrayed him, and someone that really, again, just didn't like George. He really, for some other reason, their personalities clashed out there. He kind of left by his emotions in regards to being betrayed twice, and also the fact that he didn't really get along with George. And because of that, he was not flexible. And I think the best players within the game are the ones that are flexible. It's like Haley, who's able to flip-flop back and forth between different groups. The fact that when she came back, I think that she's played a much more subtle game since she's come back after being eliminated, and she's not been at the front making the big move. She's been happy for George to be the person that everybody views as the big threat the whole time while she sits behind him. I think you need that type of flexibility, similar to how George has had it from the beginning of the game. And I think potentially that is the thing that Andrew just didn't have, and he lacked that within the game. And ultimately that was probably his downfall, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. And I think added to that as well, he became a big threat due to winning a couple of immunity challenges and reward challenges there. But as you say, I think the biggest thing for Andrew was he was so hurt by Haley lying to him as he perceived it. And again, set his sights on George as well. He really didn't have that ability to work with them further in the game, and put all his eggs in the basket with the Brawn, who, after Emmett went out, they were basically the minority alliance and there was no path forward with them. He certainly didn't reach out to Way and Haley as much as I would have liked to have seen. Certainly Danny and Flick have done all the legwork in trying to bring them over to their side and, try and eliminate George. Whereas I think Andrew has, not taken on as much responsibility to try and heal those wounds that were made between him and Haley especially. So certainly, not being able to forgive Haley and George for their shortcomings in the game is something that really hurt him. And as well, losing Laura, a great ally for him as well, really hurt him as well.
Marcus here in the chat says a lot of Brawn players' downfall so far this season has been the fact that they've been focusing on George instead of looking out for real threats like Haley. So kind of it sort of touches on what I mentioned here. Haley's played it perfect because she's allowed for George to be the person that everybody thinks is running the game, and he is to a certain degree running the game. But, in the beginning of the game, she wanted to make a lot of those big moves herself very early on, which got her voted out. So she's pivoted and adapted since then. And a lot of people are now just focusing on George as that person that's right in front and the visible threat going into the game. Now, in this second episode, there's this really funny scene with George walking around saying he's now the alpha male in the tribe because he's the only person there, and we see him carrying sticks and trying to carry big logs, and then from the side here comes Danny, and she picks up this massive log, walking it in, showing us that there's another alpha still around. And the continued battle between Danny and George, I was living for it. And Danny, for me, is a player, Riley, that I picked up the JLP was having subtle digs at her throughout the episode, saying she's always 100% correct or 100% confident. And it's something I picked up a few times earlier in the podcast where I said she always feels like she's got the plan, but then somebody one-ups her on that. And because of that, I felt like she was overconfident. But I tell you what, Riley, Danny is pretty high up on a list of players for me that came into this season and played a pretty good game. I feel like she was outplayed by a few smarter players, but I wouldn't be angry at seeing her in a future season of Australian Survivor again. I think she gave us a lot this season.
Yeah, I've been really impressed from Janie, and certainly after that Simon blindside, I thought she might have the writing on the wall and potentially have put too much of a target on her, but she managed to really downplay that threat level and has worked really well with the likes of Flick, Emmett, Andrew, and that alliance. Obviously, they ended up in the minority and couldn't really convince Flick to rather Haley to work with them and get them to flip back over to their side. But I think, Danny has come across as someone that's obviously very strong in challenges, has been pointed out many times. And in this second episode of the week, she does win immunity, which was great to see from Danny. And again, I think she's also been very perceptive as well. Certainly her strategy all the way along in the pre-merge was to get rid of the alphas. But as you mentioned there before, George viewed himself as the alpha, although Danny was a bit hesitant about that. She wanted to be the alpha, and it happened again. The alpha got sent out of the game, and Danny was the one with the writing on the wall there. But I've really been impressed by Danny. Certainly, the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of content from her, and she has really changed and learned to adapt to the strategic side of the game. And I've really liked that work in between Danny and Flick. Such a great alliance we've seen, and I think it was in the first episode of the week they won the Pastor Award. Started working on trying to bring Haley and Way over to their side. So Danny has done a lot of the legwork in terms of trying to flip the alliance.
Yeah, she's really worked hard on trying to get that girls alliance together, trying to be girls strong towards the end, take out the last remaining guy in the game. And, her challenge prowess have been really impressive to watch when it came to throwing those balls or the sandbags or the different things. She's clearly got really good hand and eye coordination and some skills out there when it comes to that. And she was a bit of a challenge beast herself. It's funny, whenever someone becomes a challenge beast, the only challenge beast that hasn't really been taken out in the game yet is Haley. But consistently, the person who's winning the most challenges, they have become the next target. And then another person to sort of mention in there, you mentioned Flick. She's always either the second or third last person to winning. She doesn't win as many or any, but she's always in the running potentially to win some of these challenges as well. And she's always just been falling short just that little bit. But overall, I was really hard on Danny early in the season when she betrayed Simon, because I liked Simon, so maybe I was a little bit bitter. But not just that, I also thought that Simon was someone that would work with her pretty deep in the game, and he really trusted her. But she did go a lot further than what I thought she would after she made that move. So clearly she knew best what she tried to do out there, and it got her to the position that she got in the game here. In any case, another sort of scene on the episode that is extremely funny to watch is George going around saying that he's learned so much while he's out there in Survivor. He now knows how to do camping skills, cooking skills. He's even washing his own clothes now, Riley. He's in his 30s and he's only just now learned how to wash his own clothes. That to me was hilarious.
Yeah, he's certainly come out of his comfort zone, from being the politician from Bankstown. He's now, almost become the king of Cloncurry at this point. Certainly expanding his horizon and learning how to adjust in the bush. And we did see him in the following episode talking about the rain and how bizarre it was to have rain finally after 42 long days. Certainly George has had an enormous story arc this season. And, as George knows, I wasn't the biggest fan of him in the preseason, and it took me a while to warm up to him. But he never says die, and it reminds me a lot of Harry Hills from Australian Survivor 2019 in the fact that his back's always been against the wall, but he's time and time again managed to scramble and find a way out of things, mainly by advantages, but also by scrambling and trying to create alliances, flipping people as well. And I think, I do think at this point, if George gets to the final tribal council, he'll win. But I'm not sure that Haley and Way and Flick will actually let him get there. And I certainly do think that he might have a similar ending to Harry Hills in this season, or potentially Luke Toki.
Yeah, I don't think he makes it all the way, but I also want to throw that out there because you mentioned that he'll definitely win when he gets to the end of the game, and I do think he would deserve to win. Like, I think he's the best player this season, but I am wondering if he actually has the jury's respect if he gets to the end here, because he's flip-flopped a lot back and forth, he's controlled a lot of the votes, but there is that whole conversation at the end of the Tribal Council in episode 3 where he talks about the fact that all he now needs to do and focus on is Outlast. That's where his strength is, Outlast. And Flick then says she believes, and Danny also, when she votes, had a really snarky comment where she voted for George and she said, "You think you've got a shiny resume? I think you've got it's more like a turd resume," or something like that. So clearly, Danny and Flick don't look as highly on his game because they've seen him sit out and quit in a lot of challenges, which has been a theme here for George throughout. So I think that when you look at the outwit, the outlast, and the outplay part, I think he's outwitting people and I think he's outlasting people, but I think he might not get a lot of respect for the outplay portion of his game.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this immunity challenge, we did see that the one that Danny won, Way didn't even start the challenge, and George only got up to the platform and didn't jump at all, and he basically gave up from the get-go. And obviously in the next episode as well, The reward challenge there, he doesn't even bother trying either, which is a little bit of a bad thing to be doing in Survivor. Certainly, when you get to Tribal Council at the end, that's something the jury can use against you. That's something a lot of the players can use against you, and it's something you don't want to be have against your name. You want to be trying 100% in all the challenges, even if you don't think you can win. You might as well give it your all. I look at Saray Fields in Game Changers, how she never gave up. And I know Jeff Probst loves to pick on that situation all the time, and I'll bring it up here. But certainly, you never say die in Survivor because you never know what might happen. We saw with Wei in the third episode of this week, she ended up winning immunity from behind and really just scrambling all last second to win the challenge. But it is something that will hurt George in the end if he does get there, and something that might work against him. And he might lose respect from the Brawn tribe. The likes of Emmett or Danny Flick, even someone like Andrew might disrespect that for not competing in challenges. It's certainly something that doesn't work well for you.
Yeah, and let's not forget, Andrew really didn't like George when he went out. And it's one of the things where I almost look at it like the edit can show us George in all of his glory because, and I'd be more than happy to be wrong here, guys. I don't know anything. So you guys can at me if this does happen and he does go to the end and he wins. I want him to win. I think he's played the best game, but I think that the edit can be very honest and open about how good of a game he's played if he doesn't get to the end and he loses. Can you imagine George getting to the end and he goes up against Haley and Haley wins this season against George? The backlash that fans will have, and how people will go at it. And probably from years from now, we'll still be looking at, well, did George manage the jury correctly? Did he understand what they valued? But there is a way that you can play this game where you lose a lot of challenges and you can still turn it back in the jury. If you can say that it was strategy for you to throw a lot of the challenges because you didn't want to be seen as a threat or someone that they needed to take out because you noticed that all of the people who won all the immunities and the rewards, they were the people that were getting voted out. So, there's a way he could turn that back on the jury. And should he not make the final, I would love to know what his pitch would have been if he did get there, because in this specific episode, the third episode, he really focused on the outlast part and he didn't talk about the outwit or the outplay part at all when he was trying to defend his game. And I'm sure that he didn't want to go into that because it would have put a very big threat or a target on his head going into the end game here if Haley and the others wanted to potentially take him out.
Yeah, I think there's a massive line, though, between not competing in the challenges and downplaying your threat level. I look at Tommy Sheehan in Island of the Idols in the US version, who didn't compete as strongly in the challenges because he didn't want to be perceived as a massive threat. George isn't a threat in the challenges regardless. So it's something completely different to purposefully perform poorly in the challenges and drop out, at sixth or whatever in a challenge of 10 people, as opposed to just not even trying from the get-go. Giving up at the start is just not an option. And I don't want to be harsh on George. Obviously, I know it's taxing, spending 40 days without any food other than rice and lentils. But certainly try your best in the challenges. In my mind, if I went out on Survivor, I wouldn't expect to win every challenge, but I'd certainly give it my all. Even overcoming your fears. We've seen this many times in Australian Survivor where they have these, massive diving boards that you have to jump off and grab something. And we've seen time and time again, Monica Radulovic in Champions vs. Contenders 2 overcame her fear. Champions vs. Contenders 1 overcame her fears by jumping off that platform. Sarah Ailes in Champions vs. Contenders 2 overcame her fears by jumping that platform. And they got massive respect for it. I understand, obviously, facing your fears is a hard thing to do. But certainly, I don't hold that against him in the immunity challenge. But the reward challenge in the next episode was something that really... I was disappointed in George for not competing and giving it his all.
So out of interest sake, I wonder if he's a big Richard Hatch fan. Maybe he watched Richard Hatch throw that last challenge in the first season and thought it's okay to do it, but he's doing it consistently over and over. And I understand what you're saying. I'm just sort of jokingly poking at that a little bit here. But ultimately, Danny is going to win this immunity challenge, the one that he doesn't compete in, the one that he doesn't finish. And it was really fun to see Wei and George bicker about George not completing the challenge and him showing her how far he can jump and her saying that's enough, you should try, but she hasn't even started. And it was really bizarre because they actually, we went pretty hard on George here, but it was never explained why Wei didn't do it. Like, did Wei have a fear of heights as well, or what happened there?
Yeah, I know. And it is probably harsh on George, not for me to criticize Wei. And again, I was shocked that she didn't start there. I was really surprised by that. Honestly, with Wei, I'm giving her a little bit more leniency. mainly because in that last challenge, really, thinking about the third episode of this week where George really fell behind, and Wei continued and obviously came back. I think with Wei, she's time and time again proven that she's struggling in challenges, and yeah, we can criticize her a little bit for it, but certainly George has shown that he can actually compete, and I think he's playing a much bigger game. So yeah, it is a little bit hypocritical of me not to criticize Wei for the same reasons, but at least I kind of understand why she hasn't been competing, because she hasn't been close in most of the challenges. Whereas I feel like with George talking up his game so much and acting as though he's the alpha at camp, he might as well give it a go.
Yeah, so Dale here says that it's an Aussie thing. I think they like to always try and never give up. It's part of our Aussie morals and such. It's all about playing a good game and going at it. And then Marcus here says Sandra is a two-time winner and she's known for sitting out on the Sandra sit-out bench. But there is a difference because, kind of coming back to what you said, Riley, it's being competitive in a team environment where Sandra is happy to sit out and not let the team down, where I don't think Sandra would have completely not tried when it comes to, and I mean, Marcus, you could correct me if I'm wrong. Like, I'm sure you'll be able to point at a place where she did sit out in an individual challenge, but I feel like she would have at least somewhat competed in the individual portions of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I am being very harsh on George. And certainly, George, if you ever want to hash it out over a beer, I'd certainly welcome that. I have enjoyed watching him play, but, it's been my thing from, basically before the season started, just to shit on George. And, he's played such a great game so far. But certainly, I do see a difference with Sandra sitting out. And certainly, if there's a reward on the line, a food reward, I can understand why you do that. But yeah, I mainly have grievances with the reward challenge in the third episode of this week, and him just not even trying. I think that was really, really poor thing to see, him not giving it a red hot crack. Again, I'm a little bit hypocritical in not criticizing Wei as well, but for George, someone that's been strong throughout the game, to not see him compete is a little bit disappointing. But I've got to give George props though. After Danny won, to make sure that Haley and Wei were on their side and they won't flip towards Flick and Danny to get rid of them, although I think it would have been the best option for them to go towards there. But, as you brought up before, for Haley, she really has to consider with these urns in play, is it the best option to get rid of Flick now and potentially have those grievances come back at camp? Or, if she votes out George come back into the game and, he comes back with a vengeance. I wouldn't want to get on George's wrong side at this point. I think it was the best decision for her to get rid of Flick, knowing that, Flick's already in the minority. I don't want to upset George at this point because he can do crazy things in this game, as we've seen time and time again.
Yeah, also, I think it happened in the previous episode, but just wanting to point out another thing where George is really good at downplaying his threat level. The conversation he has with Haley where he went to go lie in the poo-infested grass to listen at Danny and Flick have a conversation and sort of pick up that they don't have an idol, where he goes back to Haley and he says that, this is what I'm good at. I'm good at lying in poo, and you're good at winning challenges, So I do think he kind of, I don't think, firstly, you going at him, I think George has got a pretty thick skin when it comes to that, so I don't think he'll take too much offense to it, and it'll all be in good fun. But, I think he really is someone who understands his own strengths and weaknesses in the game. And like you said, the outwit and the outlast part is where he really excels when it comes to building these relationships. And he quite correctly tells Kara, you need to hang on to your idol, because obviously if she hangs on to the idol, they don't have to worry about that idol being unplay again and not knowing where it's going to go, which we end up finding out by the end of this week. It is going to get out of their control and it's going to go to Flick, which is going to be a massive issue, I think, for Kara and George next week, and probably going to be their downfall. The fact that Kara ends up getting really spooked here and ends up playing it, which now causes distrust within that really strong group of four that they've had up until this point. So again, George really reading the situation really well here, understanding that playing the idol will show these two that they don't have trust. That even if George or Kara goes out here, we now know that an idol can be passed on in the season after they're voted out. So the best move at all times, plus you've got safety in the urns. But Kara, not for the first time this season, and I've loved Kara throughout the season. I think she's brought such a great character to the season. I think her and George together has just been such an interesting duo, such an unlikely duo that have worked together throughout the season, but not for the first time this season. She makes a bit of a strategic blunder here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand Kara's trepidation to play the idol and try and assure her safety. But, as you mentioned there, George rightfully told her, don't play the idol in this tribal council your name's not on the chopping block. If they're going after anyone, it's going to be George at this point.
Yeah.
And that's basically a given. But certainly, again, you mentioned the urns are there as a backup. Obviously, there is the opportunity that if they vote for Kara and Kara smashes it and it reveals nothing, she goes home with an idol in her pocket. I don't think that was ever going to happen, though. And yeah, as you mentioned, by Kara playing the idol and not letting Haley and Wei know about the idol, it created distrust. It breeds distrust at that point of the game. And, if Flick comes back to camp and they can manage to flip Haley and Wei back onto their side because Kara has played their idol and not told them about it, it does create a potential for them to lose their numbers at this point.
100%. And, George, again, like always, putting that back to, secrets, break alliances and political parties. And it will do the same within Survivor, always putting it back to the political game. But we do ultimately find out here that, Flick is going to be the person that's going to get voted out. It's going to be that 2-2-2 split. And then ultimately, I believe Flick is the person that they vote out here in the spot. But she is going to get the safety within the urn. And she had a 1 out of 3 shot here. So, if she didn't get it here, Riley, we potentially would have gotten into a position where, if 2 people here in a row missed it, we could have had a guaranteed safety urn into one of the votes. I wonder how they would have played it if it came down to it. I've got a feeling that at some point they would have made sure that safety got in there before it was one definite safety. They would have done something. Yeah. Some shenanigans from a production point of view would have happened.
And that's something I thought about when it first came up. I thought, surely if it gets to that point, or George's name is on the chopping block, and this is my tinfoil hat speaking, they do put, a save scroll in every urn. Obviously, we didn't see that, and it was quite fortunate that Flick managed to get that save scroll, obviously keeping herself alive in the game and eliminating that extra factor. So I think, from there on, knowing that the save scroll is out of the question and there won't be any more urns in the game, no more non-elimination twists to expect in the future, it changed, I think, Haley and Wei's strategy here, as it gave them the option then to do whatever they needed to do. Obviously, Kara's idol now out of the game, this urn now out of the game. So really, there's any option to be made here, and we see that that Danny ends up winning the reward challenge, taking Flick and Haley with her, and really starting to push this idea that that everything's out of the game now, everything's on the table. Let's do this. All girls to the end. Let's get rid of George because he's going to be a massive threat going forward.
100%. So, with the spa, obviously, when you go to a spa reward, people tend to put their feet up. They get, the nice shampoo, the hot water, a little bit of bubbly going. They've got nice food in their belly, probably a little bit tipsy. It's the perfect opportunity. We've seen this season after season within Survivor. When you go onto some of these rewards, it's the perfect opportunity for you to be able to strategize and be able to talk to people about potentially doing something different because you're in that game mode and you're in that survival mode the whole time while you're out there. And this is the one opportunity where you get a resemblance of or semblance of normal life where you kind of let your guard down, for a little bit. So I think it's the best opportunity for them to try and really put the screws on. And like you said, Danny and Flick, they work extremely well together, which is great to see how they sort of approach this. Obviously, ultimately, it's not going to work out for them. Also, one of the things that you mentioned earlier that I didn't get to touch on was it's really funny because it was day 42 before we had rain out there, right? So you get the rain coming out on day 42, and George says that he's happy with that. There's a little bit of complaining from some of the other people out there. I wonder what previous Survivor players thought of watching that, thinking, you lucky buggers, because every single exit interview that I've had on this channel with previous Survivor players, they always say that the rain is the most difficult part of the game. And these guys, they've been lucky for 42 days where they haven't had to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you're in the bush, rain is an absolute blessing. But certainly, in the Pacific Islands, it's always, a little bit of a curse. It makes your life miserable. It sort of reminds me a little bit of Daisy from Champions vs Contenders too. Obviously, it was raining all the time there on their season. But certainly, when she heard there was rain back home, she got very excited. But yeah, I'm sure there were a lot of disgruntled former castaways there, wishing they were playing in the outback in those conditions. Obviously, brutally hot at times, but certainly not raining all the time. So you're not always cold and shivering and pruned. I'm sure they would have been cheering for just the one day of rain in Survivor. And yeah, as you mentioned, Danny there pointing out to George that when rain hits dirt, it creates mud. And George really being out of his element. This is his first time camping, as we've heard many times.
Yeah.
You don't camp in in the middle of Bankstown, really. So this is a new experience for him, and he really has come out of his shell, really learning how to play the game and experience all these things for himself.
Dale here saying that imagine the non-elimination ep at Final Four absolutely dead. It would have been funny to see. And then Marcus here talking about Danny having had 4 different reward alliances in the KFC challenge, the Azuzu plan, Ladies Lunch, Group Spy reward challenge, and plans never work out. Love Danny though. And it's really funny because she was always so confident. And that's where JLP sort of started having a little bit of a subtle dig at her about being super confident throughout the game. And she said she was the queen of rewards. She actually went on 12 out of 15 rewards. I didn't realize that. That is an insane stat. And Haley, this episode, Riley, went for her first reward on the game. She hasn't had one before then, 42 days in. I think the only other 2 people now that have had it harder than her is probably Kara and, well, actually, Kara's been on a reward. It must be George. I don't think George has been on a reward before.
I think George must have been on one early on in the game, but certainly, not an away from camp reward. But yeah, Kara had that challenge with the candy, and so too George did, I believe, with the candy shop. So I think he has experienced that. That might be the last major award he's experienced, though. But certainly, he seemed quite content to enjoy the rice and beans back home and not partake in that. And as we discussed before, and we've really been beating this horse a fair bit. But George giving up in that challenge, I was a little bit disappointed to see that. But he seems content with rice and beans, so so be it. If he enjoys that, then be.
And it's quite funny because as the tribe gets smaller and smaller, we've seen the portions of rice that they're getting, and it's getting massive in the game. And I just look at that and I compare it to the South African Survivor at the moment, where they're really with such small portions of rice, where some of the players there actually have to go and steal some rice. I think it's quite funny on that season as well. So obviously the portions are getting a little bit bigger here towards the end as they're voting people out of the game. Now the immunity challenge we've spoken about a few times here, Riley, with Way ultimately being the person that wins it. She believes that that's going to throw people's plans out of the window now that she's won it, but we'll know not really. She was never going to be on the radar at this point. No one's really looking at her as the massive threat. But, Flick and Danny believes that with Way winning the immunity, maybe it will give her a little bit of comfort in the sense that she'll be willing to finally make that big move. And also now with everything being out of play here, she potentially could be the person that, will now feel comfortable to go against George. I have a feeling here that Way is being seen as someone that hasn't really played her own game, that hasn't really made her own decisions. So should she get to the final, dare I say, I love Baden. He's a great friend of the podcast. We've had him on the podcast twice now, but I kind of see her almost in that Baden spot at the moment if she makes a final, even against Haley. I don't know where she gets her votes.
Yeah, and I think Baden actually said that she reminds him the most of him and his position in the game. And I think he did actually mention that her being a potential 0 vote finalist in the end. I think she probably commands a little bit more respect from the jury than we actually think. Certainly, I think a lot of them have a higher view of her. And this immunity challenge win really, really helps her game to show that she can, not give up and continue to fight for her place in the game. Winning that immunity challenge was massive for her. We saw the emotion coming out of her. And certainly at Tribal Council, a lot of people respected her for that win. A really great feather in Way's cap at this point. And as Marcus says there, the jury have said they love Way. And that has been evident in the Jury Villa episodes. But I think Danny, Flick and the likes, even George and Kara as well, are really underestimating where Way sits in the game. She doesn't have as much of a resume as the likes of Haley and George, but certainly she's got a story to tell if she gets to the end, and she can really play that case at Final Tribal Council by saying, I came into the game as the weakest person and I fought my way all the way to the end. I'm standing here on day 48. You guys are all on the jury, and you looked at me on day 1 and said I'd be the first going home, and here I am. I think that's a great case for her to make, and if she can certainly get praise from the jury, it's going to be massive. But Way is really taking control of the game here alongside Haley. Those two obviously in the driver's seat. And as you said here, winning that immunity necklace gives her those assurances to try and change things up. And it gives her a little bit more safety knowing that, she can flip to the other side and still be at the next, back at camp after the next vote.
I was going to say maybe if George gets voted out here before the end, we know that he really wants to have his mark and his legacy on Australian Survivor and on this season. Maybe if he gets into jury, he'll stand up and say, Way, you should win this game because, he saved her in that first potential tribal council. So if she wins, he might feel like he had a really big impact on the season because he saved her in day one. So I wouldn't put it against him to try and vote for her. And I was going to go into what Dale said here. You mentioned that, she's really loved by the jury, but just loving someone in the jury doesn't mean automatically that they respect your game and that they're going to vote for you. They might think you're a great person. I think a lot of people thought Baden was a great person as well in the season that he got 0 votes. At the end, it does come down to who does the jury respect? What do they respect about the game that she's played up until this point? And she may have played a very, very good game. I just don't know at this point. We've seen very limited information when it comes to her game, but from what I have seen, she's looked indecisive when it comes to making decisions in regards to which way she's going to go. And it has seemed like she's listened to other bigger players like Hayley and George in regards to where they want to go in the game. So I don't know if the jury potentially will respect that at the end if she does get there. Do I think she's a great player? Do I think she's played a good game? I think anybody that has made it as deep into the game as they've made it has made it to this point in the game for a reason, and we should respect whoever has gotten to this point. And if she wins, brilliant. Maybe because of the edit, maybe because of how I see things, I don't think Way is winning this. Maybe it is because she's getting taken out before that, and maybe it is because Hayley doesn't want to go to the end with her and she'd rather sit there next to someone else who's also been saved by a twist in the game. But I don't know if even Hayley is looking at the game in that fashion at this stage. I think that her biggest and her crowning moment would be taking out George. And it's quite interesting to see here. We haven't spoken much about Kara, but Kara, yes, she makes mistakes sometimes when it comes to the strategy and playing her idol or voting for the incorrect person. But her social skills and how she keeps George in check when it comes to communicating to Way was quite impressive in these last 3 episodes as well, where she kind of said, hey, Way's quite annoyed by George. George, you need to give Way an opportunity to also be heard and also to be able to talk, because it was the most bizarre relationship between Way and George from the beginning, where George saved her, but she's not really been wanting to work with him, and it doesn't look like she'll really almost like values that relationship between her and George as much as we would have thought she would at this point in the game, because he's saved her so early on. And I think a lot of that comes down to George having a very dominating personality and Way potentially being a little bit more of an introvert and maybe feeling like she doesn't get to have an opportunity to have her say. Other stronger personalities like Hayley and Kara, who can talk and sort of assertively let George know they don't agree, they seem to be working okay with George. I think there's a psychological thing there where Way's personality type just doesn't mesh that well with George in the game.
Yeah, and we have seen sort of clash from day one. Really, they haven't been on the same level of the same wavelength, really. And Way has been a little bit trepidatious about working with George in the game. And certainly, we see again in this episode, Hayley and Way once again consider flipping on George and Kara and potentially creating a big move. In my mind, I think it would have been the best move at this point to get rid of George. Obviously, we saw that Flick found the idol, so that's a massive boon for that Brawn alliance. And it doesn't come into play at this tribal council, which will work well for Flick going forward in the game. But certainly, that can be used as currency to try and sway the likes of Hayley and Way. Obviously, it's a risky move because they might say, well, hey, there's an idol in the game. We need to do something about that. We need to go back to George and tell him about this, split the votes and get them out, flush the idol out of the game. There's the risk in that, but I think, again, it comes down to the point where, that there is that ability for Hayley and Way to flip on George at this stage, knowing that George is a big threat to win the game, thinking ahead to final tribal council on day 48. They really need to be considering who do they want to be sitting next to at final tribal council. I think it was a little bit of a misstep there for them to get rid of Danny, because, they could have still kept their numbers, 3 brains to 2 brawns, and then eliminate Danny at another opportunity. The window of opportunity to get rid of George is closing by every single day.
I get what you're saying, but here's, surprise, surprise, I'm going to disagree with you on the fact that, you said that it was a potential mistake to get rid of Danny and they could have still had 3-2. My thinking is that George and Kara are too close of a relationship where if you were to cross one of those two, Kara's been burnt before by Hayley and by Way. She's been voted out by those two. If you take George out at this step, Carla, I believe, becomes a free agent and will much rather work with Danny and Flick moving forward than have anything to do with Haley and Way. And I think at that point, Danny and Flick takes control of the game where they would get rid of either a Haley or a Way to have complete control going into the end game here. So I think Haley's move ultimately here, not to pull the sort of trigger on George, is the correct one. Even though it's scary, George should never have gotten this deep into the game in the first place. I think it's the right move because now she's got Flick on the side who's been wanting to work with her for a long time. And I don't think Flick is going to go to George and Kara. I don't think the relationship is there. So I feel like, it's really checkmate at this point now. Well, Flick is going to be safe next vote in any case. And I really think it is checkmate for either George or for Kara. And I do believe that George is going to be the person that they'll target here in the next spot, unless he wins immunity. And we know that his track record when it comes to winning immunity is not good. So if George escapes the next vote, I would be absolutely shocked, and hats off to him. If he can escape the next vote, who knows? Maybe he does go all the way and he wins this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't be so sure about him winning the immunity challenge. I think the question is whether he will actually compete in the immunity challenge going forward.
Fired.
But I've got to give massive props at the tribal council here to Flick for holding on to the hidden immunity idol, not playing it for herself. We saw there 2 votes for Flick, 2 votes for Danny, and 2 votes going towards Kara, forcing a revote. And Danny was then eliminated unanimously from there. But for Flick now, obviously, as ALOLM says here in the chat, she's guaranteed to last until the final 4. And for her, look, I view her as someone that once George goes, I think she emerges as the next big threat because she's got a lot of respect from the jury. Particularly when you look at the likes of Emmett, the likes of Danny, they sing Flick's praises very highly of her. So I think, she is a massive threat going forward. After George gets out of the game, she's probably the one they have to target next.
100%. So it does make you wonder, what is Haley's end game here? Because she has to get rid of George. I think George is falling in the next episode. Sorry to say that, George. I would love for you to continue to be in the game. Like, I've really respect the game you've played. I think you've played the best game this season, but sadly, I feel like you're going to run out of runway here at the end. And also, obviously, with losing Danny in the game, and then who's the other person here? Andrew, that we lost this week as well. I've only got George and Way really on the board here. So George, I would love for you to survive and get there to the end, but I've got a real sneaky suspicion he's going to be that next person. And then Haley, who, in my opinion, if we're going into the power rankings here of who I think is currently in the best position to win the game, I've only been down on Haley 1 week, Riley. I've come on this podcast time after time, and I've said, I think Haley's winning this season. I still think Haley is winning this season. She is number 1 in the power ranking spots for me, moving into the end game. And if I had to look at who potentially at this point is number 2 in the power rankings, I have to go with Way, to be honest. And it's the first time I'm going to put Way this high because Way is very closely aligned with Haley. I don't see them turning against each other within the next episode, maybe or 2 episodes. I think Haley and Way will continue to work very closely together. And I do think they're going to pull Flick in to make the move finally on the duo of George and Kara. And, George, who's been in my top 3 for a long time, he probably sort of remains there out of loyalty and just the fact that, if he does get through the next couple of votes, he could win this show, but he has to win at the end. So it's a toss-up between Flick and George for me at this point, and who's that third spot, to be honest. And Kara, if you're listening to this, I've been impressed with the game you've played from a social standpoint and how you've been able to connect with people and keep someone like George in line, because let's be honest, if you weren't there, I think George would have gone off the rails a few times more. I think Kara has been that thing that's kept you grounded throughout the season, and I really respect the game that she's played with George, and I've really enjoyed this duo. It's a duo that I wouldn't mind. Like, George, I think, will be a shoo-in to come back for an all-star season, but I wouldn't mind seeing the duo of them playing together again in the future and see what could happen if lightning could strike twice if they do come together here in the late game. But really, really scared for George going into this next episode. What are your thoughts on the remaining 5 players in the game, Riley?
Yeah, I'm still happy that Haley's in the game. Obviously, been my winner pick from preseason. Very happy that she's still alive. I was sort of thinking, obviously first I was thinking it would be Haley and Beta in the final 2, with Flick coming in at number 3. Obviously, after Beta went home, Flick then bumped up to my number 2 spot. But now I don't see her getting final tribal council in the end. So I think she is emerging as too big of a threat here, especially as the last Brawn stand-in. and so many strong proponents of her game being on the jury. I've got to give Hayley my number one spot in the power rankings again. I think if Flick can slip by and continue to act strongly, win a couple of immunity challenges, and find herself at final tribal council, she's got a strong case to plead. So I'm going to put her as my number 2 for this week. And George, I'm going to put him as my number 3, as much as I've shouted on him this episode for him not performing in those challenges. Certainly, he has played a great game up until this point. Great strategic game. But as you say, I think the writing is on the wall here for him going forward. I do want to say, probably for the first time since Baden has been eliminated, I'm going to change my tact. And I think we're going to see a Hayley and Cara final 2 is going to be my new prediction. I think Cara is probably going to be someone that's going to be dragged along. Again, Baden, I'm not talking negatively about your game, and I'm not talking negatively about Kara's game either, but I think that Cara could be a 0-vote finalist and potentially dragged along by Hayley as someone that, can be brought in front of the jury and not be viewed as a threat at all. So I think Cara might have some time left in the game, but for George, I think the writing's definitely on the wall.
Interesting. So I'm wondering how you think we get to a final two between Hayley and Cara, but I also think it is a possibility. I can see it easily happening. She's had a big enough edit as well to be at the end and to sort of fully understand her story and where she's come from. And also from Hayley's perspective, sitting there next to someone else who's been out of the game as well, voted out of the game, I think is a really, really smart thing to do. So, in that sense, you would imagine that they'll vote together here, Hayley, Flick, Way to take out George. And then in that next vote, the 3 brains get together to take out Flick, who's the biggest threat remaining outside of the game, giving Hayley a clear run to the end where she can choose if she wins that final immunity. Who does she sit next to in the final 2? And she ultimately takes Way out to sit next to Cara, which I think could be very, very interesting. And I think that you might have cracked the code here, the code to what's going to happen in the end game, similar to how I felt very confident in our last recap about the end game for Survivor South Africa. I think you might be onto this one as well. Now, also here in the chat, we've got Marcus saying, and we mentioned this last week, that George, Cara is to George what Trish was to Tony, and I do agree. Putting out the fires and calming George down like Trish did with Tony, I do fully agree with that. And Loyal saying, everything Hayley did almost is the right one, laying low after the comeback and voting Danny, and you are both right. Contestants are not the greatest fans of Australian Survivor. Otherwise, Hayley should have been voted out by now. And I think it's really tough because I think, let's not remove any credit from the game Hayley has played since she's come back. A lot of other players, when they are voted out, come back in the game and they play the exact same game afterwards and they end up getting voted out immediately again, where Hayley has had the foresight to adapt her game and play a different game. So I think that you can't take credit away from her. And, if Hayley does take George out, then, I've said consistently she's the second best player for me in the game, but she does become the best player in the game if she takes the best player out. So that would be her crowning moment where she would become Queen Hayley and she would win the season. Now, where she sits when it comes to winner rankings, if she gets to that point, that's off-season content that we will be talking about for sure. And I'm sure myself and Riley will debate quite heavily in regards to that. Now, Riley, any final thoughts on the episodes that we had for this week?
Yeah, certainly going to be an interesting couple of weeks ahead. Final 5 headed in now. Certainly George, as we said, the writing is on the wall for him, and it's going to be really interesting to see, whether he survives this next tribal council and if he can actually make it to the end. I would still love to see George somehow pull out a win and, create this miracle, praise Macedonian Jesus in that instance. But, certainly for George, his writing, his game has been so messy so far. And I think, the Survivor gods might finally catch up to him and we might see JLP snuffing his torch soon.
Sadly, I think you might be right. And listen, I look at it as a win for Australian Survivor that we've had him as long as we've had him in this season. He's been absolute TV gold. He's brought it week in after week. I mean, can you imagine the season without George? It would have been a massive failure of a season because we've lacked the big characters in general. There's only been a handful of players that have really carried the season for me from a character standpoint in any case. So looking at what's coming up here on Reality Pop over the next couple of days, we will be back on Saturday to talk about Survivor South Africa, the latest episode for this week, and it will be a time yet to be disclosed because I have to double check to make sure we've got a guest on for that one. If we don't have a guest, it'll probably be early in the Saturday. If we do have a guest, it'll be quite late on the Saturday evening. So most of us here on the East Coast and in New Zealand are in lockdown in any case. So make sure to jump in and join that. If you can't leave the house, you might as well talk a little bit of Survivor with us. And then we will also be back I'll be back to do the exit interview with the person who's going to be voted out this week. So that should come up on Sunday as well. And then I'll also be on a podcast for the challenge for episode 4. And that is locked in for 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. So if you do watch the challenge as well, go have a look at that. There is a couple of Survivor players from the world actually playing in that as well. So it is quite interesting. It's a good season so far. Riley, over to you. What do you have coming up on your other channel on Snuffed?
Yep, I'm continuing my winner series with Natalie White, the winner of Survivor Samoa. So keep an eye out for that one tomorrow, which should be coming out certainly over the next couple of weeks as these 2 seasons of International Survival wind down. I'll be doing videos on the winners and also the season as a whole. So keep an eye out there. Survivor 41 as well is coming up very soon. I'll be doing my cast assessment over the coming days. And over on Reality Pop, of course, in a couple of weeks, once the premiere rolls around, we'll be doing a pre-show with myself. I'll be joining the Survivor buffs, Adam and Gideon. Pridim as well will be there, as well as the Survivor specialists, and possibly Idled Out and Analytical Strategy as well. So it's going to be really exciting going ahead to US Survivor and the return of that. I'm looking forward to seeing, meeting all these new contestants. It's been a crazy couple of months now with, Survivor South Africa, Australian Survivor, and now coming into US Survivor. And I've said before to you, Chris, it's going to be a long stretch until Christmas, and I'm going to be burnt out from all this Survivor new seasons once Santa comes around.
100%. So to steal Riley's snuff tagline, it has been great to have you guys on the show here today. Grab your torch, head back to camp, and we'll see you next time here on Reality Pop Survivor Worldwide to talk about Survivor South Africa on the weekend. See you guys. It's been great talking to you.
Good night.